She tore the check in half. Right there, in the middle of the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan. A check worth $50,000, a bribe from the man she had agreed to meet for dinner. He slid it across the table with a smile and said, "Sign the NDA. Nobody needs to know we met." Victoria Hayes didn't call security. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood up, dropped the torn pieces into his champagne glass, and walked away. But what happened after she walked out, what she found waiting near the door, that's the part nobody saw coming. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. And if it hits you somewhere real, subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The reservation had been for 2. By 8:45, it was still for 1. Victoria sat alone at table 7, a corner booth draped in white linen, a single candle burning low between 2 untouched wine glasses. She hadn't moved the second glass. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she still believed against all evidence that people were capable of showing up. Her phone had 2 missed calls. Neither from the man she was supposed to meet tonight. One from her assistant, one from her CFO. Because even on a Friday evening, even when she had explicitly blocked her calendar, told 3 different people she was unavailable, dressed in the burgundy dress she saved for occasions that actually meant something, the company still called. She was used to that. She was less used to being stood up. Again. The maitre d', a thin man named Pierre, who had the unfortunate job of hovering near powerful people who were having bad nights, approached her table for the 3rd time in 40 minutes. "Ms. Hayes." His voice was careful. "Can I bring you anything else while you wait?" Victoria looked up from the menu she hadn't been reading. "I'm not waiting anymore." "Of course." He nodded too professionally to show any pity. "Shall I bring the check?" "Please." She set the menu down and looked across the restaurant. Couples, families, a table of older men celebrating something with cigars they weren't supposed to be smoking indoors. A grandmother feeding a toddler bites of pasta while the parents argued quietly over something neither of them would remember tomorrow. Everyone had someone. Victoria picked up her phone and opened the message thread with her friend Dana, who had arranged tonight. "He canceled," she typed. "Don't set me up again." She put the phone face down before Dana could respond. The truth was, he hadn't exactly canceled. He'd simply never arrived. No text, no call, no explanation. Just the empty chair across from her and the slow, grinding certainty that once again she had made the mistake of hoping. She was 34 years old. She had built a technology company from a laptop in a studio apartment into a firm now valued at over $12 billion. She had been on the cover of Fortune magazine twice. She employed over 4,000 people. 3 heads of state had her personal cell phone number. And she could not get a man to show up for dinner. There was something almost funny about that. Almost. Pierre returned with the check. She paid it without looking at the number pulled on her coat and stood up with the kind of composure that took years to learn, the kind that made people across the room think nothing was wrong. She was almost to the door when she heard him. "Sir, I'm very sorry. Without a reservation, there's simply nothing I can do." The voice at the host stand belonged to a different maitre d', younger, less experienced in the art of polite rejection. The man he was turning away didn't look angry. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night. He was maybe mid-30s, dark jacket that had been ironed but was still slightly wrong at the collar. One hand gripping the shoulder of a little girl beside him, 7 years old maybe, with 2 braids and a purple dress and white shoes that had been polished so carefully they almost looked new. Almost. The little girl's other hand held a small paper crown. The kind they make at school. Decorated with crayon stars and letters that read in uneven handwriting, "Birthday Girl." "I understand," the man said quietly. I made a promise to her. I told her we'd have dinner here tonight. I've been telling her for weeks." "I'm truly sorry," the host said, and he actually seemed to mean it. "We've been fully booked for months. If you'd like, I can recommend—" "Yeah." The man nodded slowly, pressing his lips together. "Yeah, that's okay." He crouched down to the little girl's level. Victoria watched him take a breath before he turned to face her, The kind of breath a parent takes when they're about to say something difficult and need a half second to make sure their voice doesn't crack. "Hey, Bug," he said softly. "Change of plans." The little girl looked at him. Her expression didn't collapse all at once. It was slower than that, the way a child processes disappointment when they're old enough to know something went wrong, but young enough to still believe an adult might fix it. "Are we not eating here, Daddy?" "We're gonna find somewhere even better." "But you said here." "I know." His voice was steady. "I know I did. I'm sorry." She looked at her paper crown, looked at the restaurant behind them, at the lights and the candles and the laughter she could see, but not access. And then she nodded a tiny, heartbreaking nod that said, "Okay," in the way only children say okay, when they're trying not to make a parent feel worse. Victoria Hayes had survived board meetings that lasted 7 hours. She had fired a CFO who had embezzled money from her company without blinking. She had taken 3 startups through economic downturns that flattened competitors twice her size. She had not cried in a professional setting in 11 years. She was not in a professional setting right now. She didn't let herself cry. But she felt something shift underneath her ribs. Something that had been frozen for a very long time. She walked toward them before she made a conscious decision to do it. "Excuse me." Both of them looked at her. The man's eyes were careful, not suspicious exactly, but guarded. The eyes of someone who had learned to read the intentions of strangers quickly. "I have a table," Victoria said. "A corner booth, already paid for. And I'm leaving." He straightened slowly. "That's kind of you, but it's her birthday." Victoria glanced at the little girl, then back at him. "You're not taking her charity. I'm offering you a table I'm not using." She paused. "There's a difference." Something moved across his face. Not offense. More like recalibration. The quiet reconsideration of a man who wanted to say no on principle, but was too tired and too committed to this little girl to let pride win tonight. "It's her birthday," he said finally, less to Victoria than to himself. "Daddy?" The little girl tugged his hand and looked up at him with an expression so earnest it could have ended arguments. "She's being nice," he exhaled. "Yeah," he said, "she is." His name was James Calloway. His daughter was Sophie. Victoria learned both of these things within the first 5 minutes of sitting down, because Sophie asked her name immediately after climbing into the booth, arranged her paper crown with great seriousness, and then said, "This is my daddy. His name is James, and he works really hard." James looked like he wanted to disappear briefly into the tablecloth. "You don't have to. We're not here to bother you," he said. "Seriously, we can just eat and—" "It's fine." Victoria unfolded her napkin. "I don't have anywhere to be." That was the truest thing she'd said all evening. Sophie ordered the pasta. James ordered the salmon, glancing at the price, and then not glancing at it again, which Victoria recognized as the small discipline of a person who has budgeted carefully for something. She ordered a glass of wine she didn't particularly need, and let herself settle into the strange, unexpected quietness of being somewhere without an agenda. "So," Sophie said, pasta not yet arrived, hands folded on the table like she was conducting a meeting. "Do you have kids?" "Sophie," James started. "No," Victoria said. "I don't." "Do you want some—" "Sophie, I'm just asking." Victoria looked at the 7-year-old across the booth from her, her paper crown slightly askew, her white shoes kicking gently under the table, her eyes clear and direct in the way children's eyes are before the world teaches them to look sideways at things. "I haven't figured that out yet," Victoria said. Sophie seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer. "My daddy wants more kids," she said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't say it, but I can tell because he always looks at babies at the grocery store." James put his hand over his face. "That is an extreme exaggeration," he said, muffled by his own palm. "You looked at a baby for a really long time at the Walmart," Sophie said serenely. "I was waiting for you to pick out cereal. You waved at it, Daddy." Victoria laughed. It came out before she could moderate it. Not her professional laugh, the one she used in meetings to signal warmth she may or may not feel, but the real kind, the kind that surprised her with its own sound. James looked at her. For just a second, something shifted in his expression. Not recognition. Something quieter than that. "She's going to be impossible when she's older," he said. "She's already impossible," Victoria said. "She's just charming enough that you don't care." Sophie beamed. The food arrived. The conversation moved. Victoria learned that James taught high school history in Queens, that his wife Claire had died 2 years ago from ovarian cancer, that he worked a second job 3 nights a week doing freelance accounting for small businesses, not because he loved numbers, but because private school tuition for a kid as smart as Sophie didn't come from a teacher's salary alone. He told her this without self-pity. That was what struck her. He spoke about his life the way someone speaks about terrain they've learned to navigate, not complaining about the mountain, just describing the path. "Why private school?" Victoria asked. "Because she tested into one that specializes in early advanced learners." He watched Sophie organize her pasta into sections with surgical precision. And because her mother wanted it. Claire researched it for months, applied when Sophie was 4. He paused. "I'm not going to be the reason she doesn't go." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot to carry," she said. He looked at her, directly, without the practiced deflection she usually got from men when conversations turned real. "Yeah," he said simply. "It is." Then, "What about you? You said you work in investments." She had said that earlier without thinking. It was the abbreviated answer she gave strangers, true enough to pass vague enough to prevent the conversation from becoming about her net worth within 60 seconds. "Something like that," she said. "Startups mostly." He nodded, neither particularly impressed nor suspicious. "You enjoy it?" "I'm good at it." She paused. "That's not always the same thing." He considered this. "No," he agreed. "It's not." Sophie had finished organizing her pasta and was now drawing something on a napkin with a crayon she'd produced from somewhere in her dress. Victoria watched her for a moment, the total absorption of a child, doing something that mattered only to her fully committed, entirely present. "She looks like her mother," Victoria asked quietly. James glanced at Sophie. His expression was tender and difficult at the same time. "The eyes," he said. "And the way she goes completely still when she's thinking about something. Claire would go quiet like that." He cleared his throat softly. Like the whole world could wait. Victoria didn't say anything. There wasn't anything adequate to say. She just sat with it, with the weight of what he carried, and the lightness with which he carried it, and felt unexpectedly the particular shame of having spent the earlier part of her evening sitting in the same restaurant, feeling sorry for herself. Sophie looked up from her napkin and held it out across the table. It was a drawing, crayon. 3 figures, a tall one on the left, a short one in the middle, a slightly taller one on the right. All 3 were holding hands. Above them she had written in her careful and uneven hand, U.S. Victoria stared at it. "That's you," Sophie said, pointing to the figure on the right. "That's me in the middle. And that's Daddy." "Sophie," James said softly. "You just met her." "I know." Sophie retrieved her crayon. But she stayed. They were the last table in the restaurant. Victoria hadn't noticed when the other diners left. She hadn't noticed when the staff began quietly resetting tables around them. She had been too absorbed in the conversation in James's story about the time Sophie had convinced her entire first-grade class that the moon was made of compressed cloud, and had presented such a confident and detailed argument that the teacher had apparently spent 10 minutes double-checking herself. "She gets that from Claire too," James said, laughing. "The absolute certainty. Claire could walk into any room and make you believe whatever she was saying, even when she was completely wrong." Was she often completely wrong? About directions constantly, about people. He shook his head. Never. The check came. He reached for it. Victoria stopped him. "Don't," she said. I'm not going to let you pay for our dinner. You're not letting me do anything. I already paid for the table hours ago." She kept her voice even. "You being here tonight actually justified the cost. Otherwise, I wasted $180 sitting alone feeling sorry for myself." He looked at her for a long moment. "Who stood you up?" She blinked. "Excuse me. You said you were waiting before you left." He wasn't accusatory, just quiet and perceptive in the way people are when they've spent enough time reading rooms to recognize when something is being left out. "Somebody was supposed to be here tonight." She should have deflected. She was very good at deflecting. "A blind date," she said instead. "Arranged by a friend. He didn't show." James was quiet for a moment. "His loss," he said finally. Simply, without the performative outrage people sometimes offered as consolation. Just his loss, like it was a fact he was stating rather than a comfort he was providing. It was the most honest response she'd heard in longer than she could easily remember. Sophie had fallen asleep against James's shoulder paper crown, still on crayon, loosely held in one small hand. He moved carefully, the practiced stillness of a parent who has transported sleeping children across many rooms, and adjusted his arm around her without waking her. Victoria looked at the two of them, and felt for the first time in years the particular ache of wanting something she hadn't known how to name until this exact moment. Not money, not success, not validation. This, just this, the ordinary weight of someone sleeping on your shoulder. The crayon drawing in your coat pocket. The meal that ran 3 hours longer than expected because the conversation was worth staying for. "I should let you go," she said. "Yeah." He looked down at Sophie. "School morning." He stood carefully, Sophie draped against him, still asleep, one hand gripping his lapel. Victoria gathered her coat. They walked toward the door together. The host held it open. The night outside was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the city look like it's made of glass. "Thank you," James said at the door. His voice was low so he wouldn't wake Sophie. "For the table. And for—" he searched for the word, "for talking to us like we were people." Victoria frowned slightly. "What else would I talk to you like?" He gave her a small, careful smile. "You'd be surprised." Sophie stirred against his shoulder, blinked, and looked at Victoria with the slow focus eyes of a child waking up in a new situation and processing it calmly. "Are you coming tomorrow?" she asked, still mostly asleep. "Sophie," James started. "I don't know," Victoria said. Sophie reached into the pocket of her purple dress and pulled out a crayon. She reached for Victoria's hand, just took it with complete confidence, the way children do before they learn that touching strangers is complicated, and wrote 7 digits on her palm. "That's our number," she said, "in case you want to come." Then she put her head back on her father's shoulder and closed her eyes. James looked at Victoria over the top of his daughter's head. His expression was unreadable in the way of a man who has learned not to hope too hard for things. "You don't have to call," he said. Victoria looked down at the 7 digits in purple crayon on her palm. "I know," she said. She walked to her car. The driver opened the door. She sat in the back seat and looked at her hand in the dark, at the crooked numbers written there by a 7-year-old in a birthday crown. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, Victoria Hayes did not feel like the most powerful and most lonely person in any room. She felt like someone who had just been given something real. The question, the one that would keep her awake for the next 3 hours, was what exactly she was going to do with it. She told herself she wasn't going to call. She made it until Sunday morning, not because she was weak, because Sophie had written the number in purple crayon on her palm. And when Victoria's driver dropped her home that Friday night, she had stood at her bathroom sink for a full minute before washing her hands, and then she hadn't washed that hand. She had gone to bed with a 7-year-old's handwriting on her palm like it was something worth keeping. That was the thing she couldn't explain to anyone, including herself. She called at 9:15 on Sunday. She told herself it was to check in. She told herself it was a polite gesture, the kind of follow-through a person of her character did after an unexpected evening. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way James had said his loss, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Sophie picked up on the second ring. "I knew you'd call," the little girl said immediately. No hello. No who is this. Just absolute certainty, the kind that only children and very wise old people possess. "Good morning to you too," Victoria said. "We're making pancakes. Do you want to come?" Sophie, is your father there?" "He's flipping them. He always flips them too early. They come out wrong in the middle." A pause, then louder away from the phone. "Daddy, it's Victoria," she called. A beat of silence. Then James's voice, closer now, a little cautious. "Hey." "Hi." She hadn't prepared for this part. "I'm sorry to call on a Sunday morning. You're not bothering us." His voice was careful but not cold. "Sophie's been up since 6 talking about you." "About me specifically, or about the restaurant?" "About you. She told her stuffed animals about you. In detail." Victoria sat with that for a moment. Should I be concerned? Probably not. She also told them about a cloud she saw shaped like a horse last Tuesday, so you're in good company. She laughed. And again, it was that real laugh, the one she couldn't moderate, couldn't professionalize, couldn't turn into something appropriate for a board meeting. Just laughter, unguarded and immediate. "Come for pancakes," James said. It wasn't quite an invitation and wasn't quite a question. It was the quiet offering of someone who had decided sometime between Friday night and Sunday morning to stop overthinking. "I don't want to impose. You sat with us for 3 hours in a restaurant you'd already paid for, and you didn't let me get the check. You're not someone who imposes." A brief pause. "And Sophie will absolutely not let me hear the end of it if you say no." That's a lot of pressure to put on a person. "Yeah," he said. "She's very good at that." She came for pancakes. She stayed until 4 in the afternoon. That was how it started. Not with a declaration, not with a plan. It started with pancakes that were wrong in the middle, and Sophie explaining with complete authority that the secret to perfect pancakes was to wait until you saw exactly 3 bubbles before you flipped, and that her daddy never waited long enough, and that Sophie Rose Calloway, aged 7, had been telling him this for 2 years, and he still did not listen. "She's not wrong," James said, eating the wrong-in-the-middle pancake without complaint. "Then why don't you listen?" Victoria asked. "Because if I make them perfect, she'll have nothing to lecture me about." Sophie looked at him across the table with the pure, unimpressed expression of someone who had heard every excuse. "That doesn't make sense, Daddy." "It makes a lot of sense." "It really doesn't," Victoria said. James pointed his fork at her. "You've been here 20 minutes. You're already on her side." "I'm on the side of properly cooked pancakes." Sophie reached across the table and patted Victoria's hand with quiet satisfaction. "I like her," she announced to no one in particular. It was the most straightforward acceptance Victoria had received from another human being in years. The weeks that followed didn't announce themselves as significant. That was the thing about them. They arrived dressed as ordinary time, as nothing more than Saturdays and school afternoons, and a series of small invitations that Victoria kept saying yes to before she'd finished deciding. A school science fair in the 3rd week of October. Sophie had built a model of the water cycle out of cardboard and plastic wrap and a small battery-powered fan, and she explained it to every adult who stopped at her table with the focused intensity of someone presenting a doctoral thesis. She won 2nd place. She was completely unbothered by 2nd place because, as she explained on the drive home, the kid who won first built his with his dad, who is an actual engineer, and that feels like cheating to me. James had looked at Victoria over Sophie's head with an expression that said, "I've already had this argument and lost." "Seems reasonable," Victoria said. "Thank you," Sophie said. "You're not supposed to agree with her," James told Victoria. "She made a compelling argument." "She always makes a compelling argument. That's the problem." A community fair 2 weeks after that, where Sophie dragged both of them to every booth with the efficiency of a military operation, ate 2 corn dogs. won a goldfish by throwing ping-pong balls into small glass bowls with alarming accuracy, named the goldfish Gerald, and then fell asleep on James's shoulder on the walk back to the car while still holding the bag with Gerald in it. James had carried her. Victoria had carried Gerald. And standing at the car in the cool October dark, watching James buckle Sophie in with the careful efficiency of 10,000 repetitions, Victoria had thought, I have never in my life carried a goldfish before. And then she had thought, that is a strange thing to feel good about. She felt good about it. A Sunday dinner in November that was supposed to be takeout Chinese food and turned into James attempting to cook actual dumplings from scratch because Sophie had declared she wanted to learn, and the kitchen had descended into flour and chaos, and a dumpling that James described as more of a philosophy than a food. And Victoria had laughed so hard she had to sit down on the kitchen floor, which she had also never done before. Laughed until she had to sit down on someone's kitchen floor. And Sophie had laughed because Victoria was laughing, and James had stood there holding his failed dumpling, looking between them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Later, when Sophie was in bed, he'd said to her quietly, I haven't heard this kitchen sound like that in 2 years. She hadn't known what to say, so she'd said nothing, and he'd nodded like that was okay. Like silence between people could sometimes mean more than words. She was learning that about him. James Calloway did not fill silence with noise. He let it sit, and he let it mean something, and he didn't seem to need her to explain herself in the moments when she couldn't. After years of conversations where every silence was a negotiation, every pause a strategy, every dinner a transaction, that alone was enough to keep her coming back. The thing she had not told him, it was there always. A door she kept closed every time their conversations moved toward her work, her life, the version of her that existed outside these Saturday afternoons and Sunday kitchens. Investments, she kept saying. Startups. Enough truth to build on, not enough to explain the private jet. Not enough to explain why her assistant texted her in multiple languages. Not enough to explain the security detail she'd started parking 2 blocks away because she didn't want to answer questions about why she needed one. She had been here before, this exact place, this exact calculation with other men. Men who had asked about her work and received the full answer, and whose eyes had changed in ways she recognized and couldn't unknow. The slight recalibration, the almost imperceptible shift in posture, the way the conversation from that moment forward was never quite between 2 people again. She didn't want James's eyes to change. That was the part she admitted to herself on the drive home after the dumpling disaster. Gerald the goldfish sitting in his bag on the seat beside her, because Sophie had insisted she take him for the week, so he could see a different house. She didn't want his eyes to change because she was terrified they would. Because every man before him had eventually wanted something. Not always money. Sometimes access. Sometimes status. Sometimes just the story, the ability to say at a dinner party, I'm seeing Victoria Hayes, and watch the room rearrange itself. James had never once Googled her. She was almost certain of it. He would have said something. He was not a man who knew things and stayed quiet about them. He just treated her like a person, like specifically her Victoria, who ordered red wine she didn't finish, and laughed too hard at Sophie's logic, and sat on kitchen floors and carried goldfish in plastic bags through October parking lots. Not Victoria Hayes, founder and CEO, net worth 12 billion Forbes cover keynote speaker, the woman who had built something from nothing and lost herself somewhere in the building of it. Just Victoria. She didn't know what to do with being just Victoria. She hadn't been just Victoria in a very long time. Can I ask you something? James said one evening in late November. They were sitting at his kitchen table after Sophie had gone to bed, 2 mugs of coffee between them. Gerald the goldfish, now a permanent resident on the kitchen counter, where Sophie could monitor him at breakfast. Sure, she said. He turned his mug in his hands. Why are you still coming here? She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, he stopped, started again more carefully. You're clearly successful. Clearly busy. You've canceled what must be important meetings to come to a school science fair in Queens. You carry a 7-year-old's goldfish home for a week." He met her eyes. "I'm not complaining. Sophie loves you. And I—" Another pause. "I look forward to when you come. I just want to understand what this is for you." It was the most direct he had ever been. It surprised her enough that her first instinct was to deflect to say something easy and slightly sideways to buy herself room. But he was looking at her the way he looked at things that mattered, with the quiet, steady attention of someone who actually wanted the true answer. "I don't know how to explain it," she said honestly. "Try." She looked down at her coffee. "I live alone. I've lived alone for a long time. I have a home that cost more than most people will earn in their entire lives, and most nights I don't walk through more than 3 rooms of it." She paused. "When I come here, the kitchen is a mess, and Sophie is arguing about something, and there's a goldfish named Gerald on the counter, and I—" She stopped. "And," he said. "And it feels like something real," she said. "I know that sounds—" "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." She looked up. His expression was open in a way she'd learned to recognize the way James looked when he'd decided something was worth being honest about. "When Claire died," he said slowly, "I had a lot of people tell me they were there for us. A lot of them meant it. Most of them disappeared within 6 months because grief is uncomfortable and people have their own lives." He wasn't bitter about it, just accurate. "Sophie and I got very used to it being the two of us." He looked at her steadily. "And then you showed up, and you keep showing up. And I want you to understand that matters. To her." A breath. "To me." The room was very quiet. "James, I'm not asking you to be something you're not," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that this isn't one-sided, whatever this is." He picked up his coffee mug, looked at it. "Even if we're still figuring out what to call it." She could have told him then. She had thought about it 100 times, and she could have done it right then, could have said, "I have to be honest with you about who I am." Instead she said, "I'm glad I stayed that night." He looked at her. Something in his face softened. "Me too," he said. Gerald the goldfish moved through his little tank on the counter. Outside, the city made its constant noise. And somewhere in the back of the apartment, Sophie slept, probably dreaming about the next thing she was going to be completely certain about. Victoria thought I should tell him. And then she thought, not yet. Just not yet. She told herself she'd find the right moment. She told herself she'd know when it was. She told herself it wouldn't matter, that when the time came, James Calloway would hear the truth, and it wouldn't change anything because he wasn't like the others. She believed all of that. She was almost right. December arrived and Sophie wanted a Christmas tree. "We always get one," she told Victoria on the phone very seriously. "Daddy and I go pick it out together. It's a rule. Do you want to come?" "That sounds like a family tradition," Victoria said carefully. "Yes," Sophie said. "And your family now, so?" There was a silence in which Victoria tried to find a response adequate to that sentence, and could not. "Sophie." James said somewhere in the background, "You can't just tell people they're family." "Why not?" Sophie asked. Another silence. "Victoria," James said. "You don't have to." "I'll come," Victoria said. She heard James exhale. She couldn't tell if it was relief or resignation or something between the two, and she found she didn't care much which one it was. She was coming. That was the fact that mattered. They picked out a 6-foot tree on a Saturday morning and carried it back to the apartment and spent 4 hours decorating it. And Sophie narrated every ornament this one was, from the year she lost her first tooth. This one her mother had bought in Vermont on a trip before Sophie was born. This one Sophie had made herself in kindergarten, and it was slightly terrifying, but it went at the front because Daddy always put the ones she made at the front. Victoria hung an ornament she'd bought at the lot, a simple glass star, nothing remarkable. Sophie put it on the highest branch she could reach. "That one's yours?" Sophie said. "So it's here when you come back." James was untangling a string of lights with his back to them. His shoulders were very still. Victoria looked at the little glass star on the branch. She thought about the empty apartment she'd go back to tonight. She thought about the 3 rooms she walked through in a house with 11. She thought about Gerald the goldfish, who was currently back at James's apartment because Sophie had decided he preferred it there. She thought about what it meant that she had not argued. "Okay," she said softly. Sophie patted her arm with great satisfaction and went to argue with her father about the lights. Victoria stood at the tree and looked at the glass star and thought, "I have to tell him." She thought it like a sentence she'd been writing for weeks that she still hadn't finished. She had no idea the choice was about to be taken out of her hands. The call came on a Tuesday. Victoria was sitting at James's kitchen table, helping Sophie with a book report on the American Revolution, when her phone lit up with a number she recognized immediately. Her head of global operations, Marcus Chen, who had standing instructions never to call her personal cell unless something was on fire. Something was on fire. She looked at the screen for 1 full second, then looked at Sophie, who was chewing her pencil and staring at a paragraph about Paul Revere with the focused suspicion of someone who believed the story was leaving something important out. "I have to take this," Victoria said. "Okay," Sophie said, not looking up. She stepped into the hallway, closed the kitchen door behind her, kept her voice low and level, even as Marcus told her what she already half knew from 3 days of monitoring market signals that had been moving wrong, the kind of wrong that starts quietly, and then without warning becomes catastrophic. Her company's largest overseas partner had frozen assets. A regulatory decision out of Brussels had triggered a contractual cascade she'd had legal teams working to prevent for 6 months. 3 board members were demanding an emergency session. Her CFO had been on the phone with the SEC since 6 that morning. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough that you need to be in London by Thursday." She closed her eyes. "What's the exposure?" he told her. She didn't react visibly because she'd spent 15 years training herself not to react visibly to numbers. But her hand tightened on the phone until her knuckles were pale. "Book the flight," she said. "I'll be at the office in 2 hours." She hung up, stood in the hallway for a moment very still, recalibrating the way she'd learned to recalibrate. Fast, clean emotion filed away for later. She had a company. 4,000 people who had rent and mortgages and children of their own. She did not have the luxury of falling apart in a hallway in Queens. She pushed the kitchen door open. Sophie was still working. James was standing at the stove making tea, his back to her, and he turned when she came in with the expression of a man who could read a room. "Everything okay?" he said. "Work thing," she said. "I have to go." Sophie looked up. "Now." "Yeah, bug." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "I'm sorry. Finish the report. You've got the 3rd paragraph almost exactly right. You just need 1 more detail about the Sons of Liberty." Sophie accepted this with her characteristic practicality. "Will you be here Saturday?" Victoria paused. She looked at James. He was watching her with that steady, careful attention he always gave her when something mattered. "I'll let you know," she said. It was the first time she hadn't said yes. She was not there Saturday. She sent Sophie a text with 3 facts about Paul Revere that weren't in the textbook, which Sophie responded to with 4 emojis, and the information that she'd gotten 100 on the report, which Victoria saw while boarding a plane over the Atlantic and felt briefly like something in her chest had relocated. London was brutal. Not in the way people imagined when they pictured crisis management at her level, not screaming and chaos, but the opposite. The terrible focused quiet of too many intelligent people in too many rooms, working through problems that required all of their attention and none of their feelings. She slept 4 hours the first night. 3 the second. She negotiated with regulators who wanted concessions she couldn't give, and lawyers who wanted patience she didn't have, and board members who kept using phrases like long-term stability, as though that were something that existed independent of immediate action. She called Sophie on day 4 because Sophie called her first at 7 in the morning London time, which was 2 in the morning in New York, which Sophie did not know and would not have cared about if she had. "I'm learning to make scrambled eggs," Sophie announced. Daddy is supervising, but I'm doing the actual work. That's good, Victoria said. She was sitting in a hotel room that cost $3,000 a night and looking at a wall of financial projections on her laptop. Are you using butter? Daddy says butter. I say it doesn't matter. Butter matters. That's what he said. A pause. Are you coming back soon? I'm working on it. Is your work very hard? Victoria looked at the wall of projections. Yeah, she said. It is right now. Daddy says hard work is how you know something is worth doing, Sophie said. Then, hold on, he wants to talk to you. A shuffle. Then James's voice quieter than Sophie's, slightly careful, in the way it got when he was choosing words. Hey, he said. Hey. You sound tired. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you sound tired. He wasn't challenging her. It was the way he always did. It made space for the true version of things without demanding it. Wherever you are, it sounds serious. It'll resolve, she said, which was true, but not an answer. Victoria. He said her name the way he said things he'd decided to be honest about. Is there something you want to tell me? Her laptop screen showed her company's name in the header of a regulatory document. She reached over and turned it face down. Not yet, she said. I'm sorry, not yet. A silence that was not comfortable the way their silences usually were. Okay, he said finally. And then, Sophie, say goodbye. And Sophie's voice returned, telling her to eat something and come back soon, and that Gerald had developed what Sophie believed was a cold, but was probably fine. She hung up and sat very still in the expensive hotel room and felt the weight of the two lives she was living press against each other in a way they hadn't before. Days became weeks. She called when she could, which was less than she wanted. The calls got shorter as the crisis deepened, not because she wanted them shorter, but because every spare minute was consumed by decisions that affected thousands of people, and she couldn't let herself be distracted, couldn't afford to sit on the phone listening to Sophie talk about Gerald's hypothetical cold when there were asset structures unraveling in 3 countries simultaneously. She knew how it must look from the other side. She knew because she'd been on the other side of disappearing people, and she knew exactly what the silence felt like to the person waiting in it. James sent her a text in the 3rd week that said, "Only Sophie asked if you're okay. I told her yes. I hope that's true." She stared at that text for longer than she should have. She typed, "It's true. I'll explain everything when I'm back. I promise." She hit send and then went back into a board meeting that lasted 6 hours. The first crack appeared 10 days before she came home on a Friday evening when she was in the back of a car moving through central London, and her phone showed a news notification, the kind she'd trained herself not to read in moving vehicles because they were rarely good. This one was from the Wall Street Journal. The headline included her name, her company's name, and the words, "Financial Crisis" and "Regulatory Overhaul." She sat very still. It wasn't inaccurate. That was the worst part. Every word was technically accurate, assembled into a story that emphasized the chaos and the scale and the names involved. Her name, her company, her decisions. Her phone started ringing before she'd finished the article. It rang and rang and rang. James called at 9:15 that evening. She saw his name and knew with the particular certainty of someone who has been dreading a specific moment for weeks that it had arrived. She let it ring. She told herself she'd call back. She told herself she needed 20 minutes, needed to be somewhere quiet and clear-headed, needed to not be in the back of a car in London traffic when she had this conversation. She called back at 11:30. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "Hey," she said. "I saw the news," he said. 3 words. No accusation in them. Just "I saw the news," which was worse than accusation because it meant he'd been sitting with the information long enough to decide how he wanted to say it. "James." "Victoria Hayes," he said. Not a question. "Founder and CEO. $12 billion company." He paused. "That's you." "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "Investments," he said quietly. "Startups." "I know. You've been coming to my apartment for 2 months." His voice was still level, still controlled, but she could hear the thing underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated than anger. The specific hurt of someone who had chosen to trust and discovered the ground wasn't what they thought it was. You've sat at my kitchen table. You've helped Sophie with her homework. You know every teacher at her school by name. He stopped. And you didn't tell me. I was going to. When? She didn't have an answer for that, because the true answer, when I was sure, when I felt safe, when I was certain your eyes wouldn't change, sounded like what it was, fear dressed up as strategy. I'm sorry, she said. I need you to help me understand. He wasn't shouting. She almost wished he were. Shouting she knew how to handle. This, the quiet, measured hurt of a man trying to be fair to someone who may not deserve it, she didn't know what to do with. Why didn't you just tell me? Because people change when they find out, she said. It came out more raw than she intended. Every time. Someone finds out who I am, and everything shifts, and I can never unsee it happening, and I didn't. She stopped, pressed ahead. I didn't want you to change. Silence. What did you think I was going to do? He said. What did you actually think was going to happen? I didn't know, she said. I still don't. That was the point. I couldn't know, and I couldn't risk it. So instead, you built something with us, with Sophie Victoria, and you let her get attached. Let her. He stopped himself. When he came back, his voice was tighter. She talks about you every day. You understand that. Every single day there's something about Victoria. Victoria said this. Victoria showed me that Victoria thinks, and I let that happen because I trusted that what you were showing us was real. It was real, she said immediately. James, everything I showed you was real. The only thing I left out was the most important part of who you are. She had no response to that, because he was right and wrong at the same time, and she didn't have the words to explain how a person could be more real in someone's kitchen carrying a goldfish than she'd been in any boardroom in her life, and how that didn't contradict the fact that she had hidden something significant, and how both of those things could be true simultaneously. I have to go, he said. James, I'm not ending this conversation permanently. I just need to think. A breath. Sophie's asking for you. I don't know what to tell her. Tell her I'll call her tomorrow. Okay. A pause. Will you? Yes, she said. That's a promise I'm keeping. He hung up. She sat in the London hotel room in the dark and did not sleep at all. She flew home 8 days later. The regulatory situation had not resolved completely, but had stabilized enough that her physical presence in London was no longer necessary, and she had sat in enough empty hotel rooms by then to know that there was no version of a good outcome that was worth losing what she was losing. She landed at JFK on a Wednesday morning, went to her office for 4 hours because she had no choice, and then told her assistant to clear her afternoon. She showed up at James's door at 3:15. He opened it before she knocked. She wasn't sure how he'd known, whether she'd texted or he'd just heard her in the hallway, and he stood there looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Tired. Careful. Not closed, but not open the way it usually was. Sophie was at school. The apartment was quiet. Come in, he said. She came in. She sat on the couch. He sat in the chair across from her, which was the farthest point from her in the room, and she noticed that and filed it away in the part of herself that kept track of distances. I need to tell you everything, she said, all of it, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. So she told him. Not the abbreviated version. Not the professional biography. Not the story she told journalists and interviewers and profile writers who wanted the arc without the texture. She told him the real version, the studio apartment, the laptop, the first company that failed completely and took her savings with it. The second company that almost failed. The investors who told her she was too young and a woman, and neither of those were said as compliments. The men who had stayed long enough to understand her net worth and then started having opinions about how she ran her company. the one she had almost married 3 years together, and on the day she told him she was turning down an acquisition offer worth $2 billion because she believed in what she'd built. He had looked at her and said, "I think you care more about this company than you'll ever care about me." And the worst part was that she hadn't been able to immediately tell him he was wrong. She told him about the loneliness. Not the performing for charity galas loneliness, the safe kind that you could talk about in interviews, because it made you relatable. The real kind. The 3 a.m. kind. The Sunday morning kind. The kind that lived in all the rooms of a house she rarely walked through. She told him about the night she'd sat in that restaurant waiting for a man who'd never come, and how she'd been more relieved than hurt when he didn't show, because at least she didn't have to perform being hopeful for another 2 hours. She told him what it meant when Sophie held her hand that first night and wrote numbers in purple crayon on her palm. She told him she'd stood at her bathroom sink for a full minute, deciding whether to wash it off. She told him she hadn't washed it off. She told him all of it. When she finished, the room was quiet. James had not moved from the chair. He had not looked away from her once. "Why didn't you just trust me?" he said finally. His voice was not angry. It was something more painful than angry. "I didn't know how," she said. "I know that's not enough. I know it's not a good answer, but it's the true one." He stood up and walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, and she watched his shoulders and tried to read him and couldn't, and the silence stretched out in a way that felt different from all their other silences, heavier, less safe. "I have had," he said slowly, still facing the window, "exactly one person in my life who I trusted completely, and she died." He turned then and looked at her, and his face was open in a way she hadn't seen before, raw and unguarded, and costing him something to hold. "After Claire, I made Sophie a promise that I wouldn't let someone into our life who wasn't going to stay, because Sophie can't—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "She can't go through another person leaving." "James, and then you showed up," he said, "and I let you in anyway, because it felt different, because you sat on my kitchen floor laughing about dumplings and I thought, okay, this one's real." He looked at her steadily. "And she is real. I still think that. But the hiding—" He stopped. "The hiding scared me," he said. "Because I need to know that what I'm choosing is actually what it appears to be. I can't afford to be wrong about that. Not for me, for her." Victoria stood up. She crossed the room toward him slowly, and he didn't move back, which she took as permission to keep going. "I know," she said. "You're right. I should have told you. I should have trusted you with it sooner, and I didn't, and I can't undo that." She stopped in front of him. "But I need you to know that everything else, every Saturday, every dinner, every school thing I showed up to, none of that was performance. None of it. I don't know how to prove that to you except by showing up differently from here on." He looked at her for a long time. "You said you'd call Sophie tomorrow," he said. "The night we fought. You said that." "I called." "You did." Something in his expression shifted very slightly. "She told me everything you talked about. She kept the things you said, James. She wrote some of them down." He exhaled slowly. "She asked me this morning if I was going to make you go away." The words hit her somewhere in the center of her chest. "What did you tell her?" Victoria said. James looked at her, the full, unhurried look he gave things he was deciding. "I told her I didn't know yet," he said. She nodded. That was honest, and she respected honest even when it hurt. And then from behind her, from the front door that she had not heard open because Sophie had a key, and Sophie was 7, and had no concept of timing, came the sound of a backpack hitting the floor and small shoes on hardwood, and a voice that Victoria had spent 3 weeks missing more than she'd been willing to admit out loud. "Victoria." She turned. Sophie was already across the room, already reaching for her. Not cautiously, not with any of the hesitation that adults needed to protect themselves, just directly, completely, with the total confidence of a child who knew what she felt and acted on it without deliberation. Victoria caught her, held her, felt Sophie's arms lock around her neck and her face press into her shoulder, and heard the muffled, matter-of-fact voice say, I told Daddy you'd come back." She couldn't speak for a moment. Over Sophie's shoulder, she looked at James. He was watching them with an expression she would remember for a long time, the look of a man fighting something inside himself and not entirely winning. Sophie pulled back and looked at Victoria's face with the direct diagnostic attention she gave things she was evaluating seriously. "Were you crying?" Sophie asked. "No," Victoria said. "Your eyes look like crying. I was on a plane for a long time. My eyes are tired." Sophie considered this. "Okay." She kept her hands on Victoria's shoulders, as though physical contact was the surest way to confirm that something was really there. "Are you staying for dinner?" Victoria looked at James. He was still watching her. Somewhere behind his careful expression, something was working through itself, something that hadn't resolved yet, something that might take time she wasn't sure he'd give her. And then, Sophie's small hands tightened on her shoulders. And she turned from her father to Victoria and said with the simple certainty that she said everything, "Please don't leave." 3 words. The same 3 words Victoria had spent her entire adult life being unable to say to anyone, because saying them meant admitting that you could be left and that the leaving would cost you something real. She looked at Sophie. She looked at James. She felt something in her chest that she had no professional vocabulary for, no board meeting language, no shareholder presentation framework, no legal term that covered what it meant to be standing in a queen's apartment on a Wednesday afternoon, understanding with absolute clarity that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. "I'm staying for dinner," she said. Sophie released her shoulders, immediately satisfied, and went to investigate the kitchen with the focused energy of someone who had delegated the emotional labor and was now moving on to logistics. James had not moved. Victoria looked at him. "I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness," she said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance to do this right." He looked at her for a long moment. The apartment was quiet except for Sophie opening and closing cabinet doors and the small sound of Gerald moving through his tank on the counter. "Butter matters," James said finally. She blinked. "What?" "For the scrambled eggs tonight." He turned toward the kitchen. "You told Sophie butter matters. We're doing this right, you're cooking with us." He glanced back at her over his shoulder. "And yes, I know how to tell when someone's been crying. So does she." Victoria exhaled the first full exhale she'd taken, she thought, in 3 weeks. She followed him into the kitchen. Sophie was already at the stove, very serious, waiting. The scrambled eggs were perfect. Sophie announced this herself, standing at the stove with the wooden spoon in her hand and the expression of someone who had just confirmed a long-held hypothesis. Victoria had used butter. She had kept the heat low. She had moved the eggs slowly, the way her grandmother had shown her once in a kitchen she hadn't thought about in 20 years, a small woman with flour on her apron who believed that anything worth eating was worth taking time over. "See," Sophie said to her father, "this is what I've been trying to tell you." "You've been telling me to use less butter," James said. "I've been telling you to use the right amount of butter. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Victoria knows." James looked at Victoria across the kitchen with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, the particular look of a man who had spent the last 3 weeks being worried and was not yet finished. Being worried, but was willing for this specific moment to set it down. "She does seem to know," he said. It was a small thing, the smallest possible thing. But Victoria heard it for what it was, a door not closing. A thread held, rather than dropped, and she filed it away carefully in the part of herself that was paying very close attention to every signal he gave her. They ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Sophie talked about a boy in her class named Theodore, who had claimed at lunch that the first president of the United States was actually Benjamin Franklin, and had argued about it for 20 minutes, despite Sophie's repeated corrections. "Was he convinced?" Victoria asked. "No," Sophie said. "But I was right." "Being right and convincing someone aren't the same thing," James said. Sophie looked at him with the measured consideration she gave statements she wasn't sure she agreed with. "They should be," she said finally. "Yeah," James said quietly. "They should be." He was looking at his plate when he said it, but Victoria felt the weight of it land somewhere between the three of them at the table, and she understood that they were talking about more than Theodore and Benjamin Franklin, and she thought that was probably okay. That was probably how it needed to go, not in large declared moments, but in small ones like this, sideways and careful, the way people rebuilt things after they'd been damaged. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. She did not assume. She texted first every time. She asked rather than announced. She understood without being told directly that the trust she'd spent 2 months building had not been destroyed by what she'd hidden, but had been cracked, and that cracks required more care than the original construction, not less. James let her come back. He did not immediately return to what they had been before London. He was warmer than he'd been the night she came home, but more careful than he'd been before she left, and she respected that distinction. She did not push on it. She showed up when she said she would. She called when she promised she'd call. She did the work of being consistent in a way she'd never had to do before, had never needed to do because before James and Sophie, she had never cared enough about any specific relationship to discipline herself toward it. She cared now. That was the fact underneath everything else. She cared in a way that had reorganized her priorities without her fully realizing it was happening, so that she found herself in board meetings calculating not just the business cost of decisions, but the time cost. How late would this run? Could she still make it to Queens by 7? Was there a version of this that didn't require her to cancel Saturday? There almost always was. She found it. It took more creativity than it used to, and she didn't care. Her assistant, a sharp woman named Priya, who had worked with her for 6 years and had seen her through 2 company restructurings and 1 near hostile acquisition, noticed the shift within 2 weeks of her return from London. "You've declined 4 evening engagements in the last 10 days. Priya said one Thursday, standing at Victoria's office door, with the careful neutrality of someone raising a subject they weren't sure they were allowed to raise. "I know," Victoria said. "The Peterson Foundation Gala. Send a donation, double the amount from last year. The CEO dinner on the 14th. I have a prior commitment." Priya was quiet for a moment. "What prior commitment?" "A school play," Victoria said. Another silence. "A school." "Sophie is playing the narrator in a production about the 13 colonies," Victoria said. "She has 14 lines, and she's been practicing them since October, and I promised her I would be in the front row." She looked up from her screen. "Is there anything else?" Priya looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of a person they thought they knew well. "No," she said. "That's everything." "Good." Priya started to turn. Stopped. "She sounds like a remarkable kid," she said. Victoria looked back at her screen. "She is," she said. "She really is." The school play was on a Thursday evening in late January. Sophie had 14 lines and delivered every one of them with the conviction of someone who had rehearsed in front of a mirror and also in front of her father and also in front of Gerald the goldfish, who she believed was a more honest audience than most humans. She also delivered 3 lines that were not in the original script editions she had apparently made unilaterally, which her teacher had discovered at the dress rehearsal and had, according to James's account, briefly considered removing, before deciding that Sophie's version was actually more historically interesting than the original. Victoria sat in the front row between James and a mother she didn't know who smelled like lavender and cried at everything. James sat with his arms folded in the particular way he sat when he was proud of something, and trying not to make it obvious, which made it extremely obvious. When Sophie walked onto the stage and found them in the audience, scanning the rows with the focused efficiency of a child who does not consider it embarrassing to look, she found Victoria first. Her face broke into a smile that she immediately composed back into narrator seriousness, but not before James leaned slightly toward Victoria and said under his breath, "She's been telling everyone her whole family is coming tonight." Victoria felt that land in the center of her chest and stay there. "Her whole family," she said. Her words. He didn't look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the stage. But his arm, which had been folded, unfolded, and settled on the armrest between them, and his hand turned slightly open. She put her hand in his. He didn't react. He didn't make anything of it. He just closed his hand around hers, and they sat like that through the entire play. And when Sophie delivered her 14th line, and then her 3 unauthorized additions, they both laughed at exactly the same moment, and the lavender mother next to Victoria looked over at them with the soft expression of someone watching something good happen. Afterward, in the school hallway, Sophie appeared out of the crowd in her narrator costume, a blue dress that she'd chosen herself, and that had no particular historical accuracy, but that she'd been committed to and threw herself at Victoria first, which was not a choice that went unnoticed by James, and then at her father, and then stood between them, holding a hand of each, with the satisfied posture of someone who had arranged things to their satisfaction. "I think I added the best parts," she said. "You definitely added parts," James said. "Were they the best parts?" Sophie asked Victoria. "Objectively," Victoria said. Sophie nodded, settled. "I told Mrs. Patterson they made more sense, but she kept saying something about the script." She said the word script with light disdain. "Scripts are just starting points." "Please never become a director," James said. "I'm going to be a scientist," Sophie said. "Or a lawyer. Or possibly both." "Both," Victoria said. "Definitely both." February arrived, and with it the first conversation Victoria had with James about her world, her actual world, not the abbreviated version, not the managed version, but the one she lived in when she wasn't in Queens, eating wrong-in-the-middle pancakes. It happened because he asked. Not aggressively. Not as a test. They were sitting in his living room on a Saturday afternoon, while Sophie was at a birthday party down the street, and he had a book open in his lap that he wasn't reading, and he said, "Tell me about your company, the real version." She looked at him. "The real version? You've sat in my kitchen for months. I know about every difficult parent-teacher conference Sophie's had since kindergarten. I know about the February you couldn't pay the heating bill and had to ask your brother for a loan that you paid back inside of 6 weeks because you refused to owe it longer." He looked at her levelly. "You know my life. I want to know yours." She sat with that for a moment. "Most people find it overwhelming. Most people haven't been through what I've been through," he said simply. Not with self-pity, just as information. That was true. She had met very few people who had sat with real loss, the kind that restructured everything after it, and come out still capable of genuine presence. James had. She knew that about him. It was one of the things that had been pulling her toward him since the night she'd watched him crouch down to Sophie's level outside a restaurant and take a breath before saying something hard. So she told him. She told him about the first year when the company had 6 employees, and she'd been sleeping on an air mattress in her office 3 nights a week because she couldn't afford both rent and payroll, and had chosen payroll without hesitation. She told him about the Series A that almost didn't happen, the investor who had committed and then quietly withdrawn when a competitor started making noise, and the 48 hours she'd spent reconstructing the entire pitch before finding someone else. She told him about the acquisition offer at $2 billion that she'd turned down and why and what it had cost her in relationships and board confidence, and 2 years of proving she'd been right. She told him about the isolation, about what it did to you being the person who was always the most powerful in every room, how it had taken her years to understand that power and loneliness could be the same thing dressed differently, how she had watched people around her manage her rather than know her for so long that she'd half forgotten what being known felt like. "Until Sophie handed you a crayon number," James said. "Until Sophie handed me a crayon number." She agreed. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. She recognized the look, the one he got when he was integrating something, not reacting to it, but actually processing it. "Can I ask you something that might be uncomfortable?" he said. "Yes." "When you were hiding who you were, was any part of that about us? About not trusting us specifically? Or was it just pattern?" She said immediately. "It was pattern. It wasn't about you and Sophie. It was about everyone before you who had given me very specific reasons not to." She held his gaze. which I know doesn't fully excuse it. You weren't them. I should have been willing to find that out sooner. He nodded slowly, turned his book over in his hands. I'm not good at this, he said. At what? At... He searched for the word. At letting someone new into the structure. Sophie and we've got a thing. We know how it works, we know our rhythms. And it's not that I don't want... He stopped again, started more carefully. I want you here. I want you in the structure. I just need it to be real. I need to know you're choosing it, not visiting it. What's the difference? She asked. Not defensively, she genuinely wanted to know how he drew that line. Visiting is when you come when it's easy, and it fits your schedule, and it feels good, he said. Choosing is when you show up even when it's inconvenient, and you're tired, and work is pulling you somewhere else, and you still come, because you made a commitment. He looked at her. Visiting is what people did after Claire died. Choosing is what I need from someone who's going to be around Sophie. She thought about the board meeting she'd left early last Tuesday, the gala she'd declined, the calls she'd rescheduled, the Saturday she'd driven to Queens in a snowstorm because Sophie had a fever and James had a freelance deadline he couldn't push, and she had told him without hesitation, I'll be there in 40 minutes. I know the difference, she said, and I'm choosing. He looked at her steadily for a long moment. Then he set the book down on the coffee table and said, Okay, just okay. The way he said things when he'd decided them. Okay, she repeated. Yeah. He leaned back. Tell me more about the Series A. She told him. He asked questions, good ones. The kind that revealed he'd been listening to, more than she thought, connecting things she'd mentioned in passing to ideas she'd shared more fully, building a picture with the careful attention he gave everything. He wasn't impressed in the dazzled way people sometimes were. He was interested in the way someone is interested in a person, not a headline. He asked her at one point whether she was happy doing it. Not successful, not effective, happy. She thought about it honestly. Some of it, she said. I'm proud of what we built. I believe in the people who work there. But the day-to-day of being the CEO of a $12 billion company is... She paused. It's a lot of rooms and a lot of strategy and a lot of managing perception. And I'm good at all of it. She met his eyes. But I've never been as present in any of it as I am right now on this couch talking to you. He looked at her. That's either a very good sign, he said, or you need a new CFO. She laughed. The real one. The one she couldn't moderate. Probably both, she said. March brought a parent-teacher conference in which Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, the same one who had negotiated the script additions, told James that Sophie was performing 2 years above grade level in reading and writing, and that she had, in a recent creative writing assignment about someone important in my life, written 4 pages about a woman named Victoria, whom she described as, quote, really smart about money stuff, but also just regular smart, and also she knows about eggs. James had shown Victoria the text from Mrs. Patterson while they were standing in the school parking lot afterward, and Victoria had read it 3 times, and the 4th time she'd tried to read it, she couldn't see it clearly, and had handed the phone back. Allergies, she said. It's March, he said. Early season. He took his phone back, put it in his pocket, stood beside her in the parking lot without saying anything for a moment. She's not wrong, he said finally. You are just regular smart. It's one of the things He stopped himself. She looked at him. He was looking at the parking lot asphalt, with the expression of someone who had started a sentence and was now deciding how to finish it. He had been doing this more lately, starting toward something, and catching himself just before the edge of it, like a man who had decided to be honest but was still learning how much honesty the moment could hold. One of the things she said. He looked up, met her eyes, and she saw it, what he'd almost said, what he'd been carrying for a while, held carefully in the expression of a man who had loved one person completely, and buried her, and was standing in a school parking lot in March, understanding that he was close to the edge of something enormous, and was not sure he was ready to go over it. One of the things I value about you, he said finally. Careful, true, but partial. "Okay," she said softly. He nodded. They walked to the car. Sophie was waiting on the hood of it, not aloud but unbothered by this, eating a granola bar and reading a book simultaneously with the skill of someone who had made it a practice. "How'd I do?" Sophie asked without looking up. "Exceptionally," James said. "Obviously." She turned a page. "Can we get Thai food?" "Yes," both Victoria and James said at the same time. Sophie looked up from her book at both of them and smiled the small, satisfied smile of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as intended. It was a Sunday in early April when James finally took her to see Claire. Not metaphorically. There was a cemetery in Brooklyn, a section with older trees where Claire's family had a plot, and James had been going every few months since she died, not on a schedule he'd explained once, but when something happened he wanted to tell her about. He hadn't explained why he was taking Victoria. He'd just asked one morning quietly if she'd come with him. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. They went alone without Sophie, who was at her grandmother's for the day. James stood at the headstone and was quiet for a while, and Victoria stood a few feet behind him and gave him the room, and after a while he turned and looked at her and said, "Come here." She walked up beside him. He stood looking at the headstone. "Claire," he said in the low, slightly formal voice of someone addressing something important. "This is Victoria. He paused. "She's important to us, to Sophie and me. I thought you should know about her." Victoria's throat was very tight. "She's good with Sophie," he continued. "She listens to her, actually listens, not the way adults pretend to listen to kids. And He stopped. "She carries people," he said. "She doesn't always know she's doing it, but she carries people." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Victoria. His eyes were clear and direct, and more open than she had ever seen them. "I told you I wasn't ready to say certain things yet," he said. "I'm closer to ready." He looked back at the headstone. "I wanted her to know first. That's all." Victoria reached out and put her hand in his. He held it, tightly, the way you hold something you're not ready to let go of. They stood there for a long time, the three of them two, living one, not in the particular quiet of a place where people bring things they don't know how to carry alone. And when they finally turned and walked back toward the car, James's hand did not let go of hers. Not once. Spring came in sideways that year, cold one week, then suddenly warm, then cold again, as though the season couldn't commit to itself. Sophie declared it indecisive weather, and took to wearing her winter coat in the morning and carrying it home by afternoon, which she considered a perfectly reasonable solution, and which James considered a laundry problem. Victoria considered it the most normal argument she had ever been adjacent to, and she loved it unreasonably. She had been thinking about that word lately. Love. Not in the abstract way she'd thought about it before as a concept she understood intellectually and experienced occasionally in diluted forms, but in the specific, daily, sometimes inconvenient way that it had been arriving in her life since October. Love was Sophie's voice on the phone at 7 in the morning. Love was James texting her a photo of a historical error he'd found in a documentary with the caption, "You would have something to say about this." Love was Gerald the goldfish who had survived the winter and was now apparently thriving, which Sophie credited to a consistent feeding schedule, and which James credited to goldfish being harder to kill than people assumed. Love was the cemetery in Brooklyn, and a man's hand not letting go. She had not said the word to James directly. Neither had he. They had been circling it for months in the way of two people who had both been hurt by the wrong version of it, and had decided without discussing it to approach the real thing carefully, from the edges inward, making sure it was solid before they put their full weight on it. But she felt it. She felt it every day. And she was almost certain, more certain than she had ever been about anything that couldn't be confirmed by data or due diligence, that he felt it too. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in May. Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table. James was grading papers in the living room. Victoria was on the couch beside him with her laptop, working on a quarterly report that she kept not working on, because James's apartment in the evening had a specific quality of warmth and quiet that made concentration on financial projections feel beside the point. Sophie appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room with her math worksheet and the expression she wore when she had thought something through and was prepared to present it. "I have a question," she said. "About the math," James said without looking up. "No, about something else." She walked into the living room and stood in front of the couch where both of them were sitting. "Are you two going to get married?" James looked up from his papers. Victoria's hand stopped on her keyboard. Sophie looked between them with the patience of someone who had asked a reasonable question and was waiting for a reasonable answer. "That's," James started, "because Theodore's parents got married last year and his mom moved in, and now he says it's better because there's more people in the house and I think that makes sense." Sophie continued. "And Victoria is already here most of the time, and Gerald likes her, and I like her, and you like her, and—" "Sophie," James said. "I'm just saying it seems logical," Sophie said. "You're 8 years old." "I know how old I am, Daddy. I'm asking about you." There was a silence in which James looked at the ceiling briefly, and Victoria looked at the math worksheet Sophie was still holding and tried to determine whether the expression on her own face was appropriate for the situation. "Go finish your homework," James said. "That's not an answer," Sophie said. "It's the answer you're getting right now." Sophie assessed this, looked at Victoria. "He's thinking about it," she told her confidentially. "He gets that face when he's thinking." Then she turned and went back to the kitchen. James set his papers down on the coffee table. He looked at Victoria. She looked at him. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of Sophie's pencil and Gerald making the small sounds that goldfish make. "I'm sorry," James said. "Don't apologize," Victoria said. She's right," Victoria said. "She's completely right, and I think you know that, and I think I know that, and we're both just—" She stopped. "Scared?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I told you in the cemetery that I was getting closer to ready," he said. "To saying certain things." "You did." "I'm ready," he said. She turned toward him fully on the couch, the laptop forgotten. "I love you," James said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered directly without performance, looking at her with the full steady attention that had been undoing her from the very first night. "I have loved you for a while now. And I've been waiting until I was sure I wasn't going to say it and then take it back because I got scared, and I'm sure." He held her gaze. "I'm sure." The room was very still. "I love you," she said. And it was the truest sentence she had spoken in longer than she could measure. Not a managed truth, not a strategic truth. Just the plain, undefended fact of it said to a man in a living room in Queens, while his daughter did her math homework in the next room and a goldfish moved in a tank on the counter. "I've been in love with you since the dumpling fell apart," she said. "I just didn't know how to say it without being terrified." He reached over and took her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles slowly, the way it did when he was sitting with something important. "What were you terrified of?" he said. "That it would change things," she said. "That saying it out loud would make it real enough to lose." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," he said softly, "more than most people would." "I know you do," from the kitchen. "I can hear you in there," Sophie announced. "I'm doing my homework. I'm not listening, but I can hear you." James closed his eyes briefly. "She's going to be an absolute disaster when she's a teenager," he said. "She's going to be remarkable," Victoria said. "Same thing," he said. But he was smiling when he said it, the full version, not the partial one he kept for when he was trying not to, and she held on to that smile the way she had once held on to purple crayon numbers on her palm. Summer arrived with the certainty that spring had been unable to manage. Victoria made changes. Not all at once, she was too pragmatic for dramatic overhauls, too aware of the complexity of what she'd built to dismantle it carelessly. but she made them deliberately, one by one, in the way of someone who had finally identified what she was building toward, rather than just what she was building from. She promoted her COO, a brilliant and underutilized woman named Sandra, to a role with significantly more autonomy. She restructured her travel schedule to eliminate overnight trips that could be achieved in a day. She moved 3 standing evening commitments to mornings. She began for the first time in 11 years taking weekends off, not completely, not perfectly, but meaningfully in the way that registered as a real choice. Priya watched these changes accumulate over June and July, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had wanted to suggest them for years and known better than to. "You seem different," she said one afternoon in late July. "Different how?" Victoria said. "Less." Priya considered carefully. "Less like you're trying to outrun something." Victoria thought about that. "I'm not," she said. "Anymore." She meant it. She had spent 15 years building a company that proved she was worth something to investors, to the market, to the particular set of people from her past who had underestimated her and whom she had carried as fuel for longer than was healthy. She had mistaken momentum for meaning. She had confused being needed for being loved. She had built something extraordinary and stood in the middle of it, feeling like the loneliest person in every room. She was not the loneliest person anymore. She was someone Sophie called first when something happened at school. She was someone James texted history articles to at 10:30 at night, because he knew she'd find them interesting. She was someone who knew which cabinet Gerald's food was in, and which nightlight Sophie preferred, and what James took in his coffee, and where the extra blankets were, and all the small, specific knowledge of a person who has been let inside a life and stayed there. She was not a visitor. She was choosing. Every day, she was choosing. The night in August began without ceremony. Sophie had gone to bed at 9, later than usual because it was summer, and she had been negotiating bedtime aggressively since June, and had won a 30-minute extension through an argument James described afterward as genuinely impressive and also exhausting. Victoria had sat in the backyard with James afterward, the way they often did on warm evenings, the small backyard behind his building, that was really more of a concrete rectangle, with 2 chairs and a string of lights he'd put up in June, because Sophie had asked for them. They were quiet for the while. Comfortable quiet. The kind they'd been building for almost a year now, the kind that didn't need filling. Then James said, "Stay here. I want to show you something." He went inside. She heard him moving around more movement than seemed necessary for retrieving something simple, and she sat in the warm August dark and listened to the city doing its constant thing around them, and felt, as she had been feeling all summer, the specific peace of being exactly where she intended to be. He came back out. He was not carrying anything she could see. He stood in front of her. He looked, she registered this a few seconds before she understood what it meant. Nervous. James Calloway, who had sat with grief and financial pressure and 2 years of doing everything alone without falling apart, was nervous in a way she had not seen before. His hands were not quite still. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself. "Okay," she said. "Give me a second." "James?" "Victoria." He took a breath, let it out. And then he went down on one knee in the concrete backyard under the string lights Sophie had asked for, and opened a box that he must have been holding the whole time, and looked up at her with the steadiest eyes she had ever seen on any person in any room. "I practiced this," he said. "I had a whole speech. It was good. I wrote it down. I've been revising it for a month." She could not speak. "I can't remember any of it right now," he said. "So I'm just going to say the true version." She nodded. She was aware that her face was doing things she could not manage. "When I met you, I thought I was doing you a favor," he said. "I thought I was the one being generous, letting a stranger share a table, making small talk, being decent. And then I spent the rest of that night understanding that you were the one who did us the favor, just by staying." He held her eyes. "You stayed, Victoria. You kept staying. You stayed for dumplings that didn't work, and a goldfish that doesn't do anything interesting, and a kid who will argue with you about anything, and a man who needed way too long to say the things he felt. He paused. You stayed. She pressed her hand over her mouth. I don't have $1 billion, he said. I have a daughter who loves you, and a job that I believe in, and a backyard that is genuinely not impressive by any standard. His voice dropped slightly. But I have the ability to choose you every day. To show up for you the way you've shown up for us. To be someone who makes your life feel like something worth coming home to. He looked at her steadily. I want to be that person. If you'll let me. He opened the box fully. The ring was simple. A single stone, elegant and unshowy. She would learn later that he had spent 6 weeks saving for it alongside the school tuition and the bills and the freelance work at night. She would learn later that Sophie had helped him pick. It had been consulted in complete secrecy, which was, as James put it, the most stressful secret Sophie had ever been asked to keep, and the fact that she'd kept it for 6 weeks was something he considered one of her greatest achievements. She did not know any of that yet. She just knew the ring and the man on one knee and the string lights above them and the city around them, and the fact that she was crying in a way she had not cried since she was a person who still knew how to do it without deciding to. Yes, she said. It came out before she was fully ready to say it, which was exactly right, because it meant she wasn't calculating. It meant it was just true. Yes, she said again more completely. He stood up. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were still not quite steady. She held them in both of hers until they were. And then she put her arms around him in the small concrete backyard, and he held her the way he held things he didn't want to let go of completely, without reservation. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that the silence didn't already know. From inside the apartment, a window opened. They both looked up. Sophie was leaning out of it in her pajamas, paper crown askew. She had never fully abandoned the paper. Crown had simply replaced it with new ones, as the old ones wore out, with the expression of someone who had been asleep and had also absolutely not been asleep. Did she say yes? Sophie asked. James looked at her. Were you listening? I was sleeping, Sophie said immediately. Did she say yes? Sophie. Daddy. Did she say yes? James looked at Victoria. The corner of his mouth moved. She said yes, he said. Sophie's face broke open into the kind of joy that only children and very lucky adults get to feel total unguarded, taking up the whole face. I knew it, she said. I told Gerald she'd say yes. Gerald, she said yes. She disappeared briefly from the window, presumably to update the goldfish. Then she reappeared. Can I come outside? It's 9:45, James said. It's a special occasion. Sophie? Daddy, she said yes. He looked at Victoria. She was already looking at him. And something passed between them that was not a decision exactly, but the recognition of one already made the acknowledgement of what they were. Now, what they had been building toward since the night, a woman with a reservation for two and a man with a reservation for none, had ended up at the same table, and something that was supposed to be a bad night had turned without warning into the beginning of everything. 5 minutes, James said. Sophie was outside in 30 seconds. She came directly to Victoria and took her hand and looked at the ring with the focused, evaluative attention she gave everything she considered important. It's pretty, she said. I helped pick it. I know, Victoria said. Your father told me. He did. Sophie looked at James. Just now, he said. Sophie looked back at Victoria with the slight satisfaction of someone whose involvement has been appropriately acknowledged. Do I call you Mom now? She asked. The word landed in the warm August air between all three of them. Victoria looked at Sophie. This extraordinary impossible. Entirely her own person of a child who had written a phone number on a stranger's hand at age 7 and set 3 lives in motion without knowing it. Who had told stuffed animals about a woman she'd met once and written 4 pages about eggs and introduced Victoria to a goldfish named Gerald and said please don't leave at the exact moment it needed to be said. She looked at James. He was watching her with open eyes and an open face, and his hands in his pockets, and all the love of a man who had decided finally to stop being careful with it. "Not yet," Victoria said to Sophie gently. "But someday, if you want." Sophie considered this with the serious deliberation it deserved. "I want," she said. Then she put herself between them, reached up, and took one hand of each, and stood there in the backyard, under the lights in her pajamas and paper crown, looking up at both of them. "This is us," she said, simply, factually. The way she said things, she had decided were true. James looked at Victoria over the top of Sophie's head. "This is us," he said. Victoria looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at the string lights above them. She looked at the man she loved and the daughter she was learning day by day to be worthy of. She thought about the night a blind date had never shown up, and she had sat alone at a table for two in a restaurant she'd already paid for, about to leave, about to go back to the enormous empty house and the 3 rooms she walked through, and the life that looked extraordinary from the outside and echoed on the inside. She thought about what it had cost her to stay that night. Nothing. It had cost her nothing, and it had given her everything. She squeezed both of their hands, James's on her left, Sophie's on her right, and looked up at the August sky above a concrete backyard in Queens, and understood with the certainty of someone who has finally stopped running from the thing they needed most that the greatest investment she had ever made was not a company or a strategy or a decision made in a boardroom, with the future of thousands of people hanging in the balance. It was a split-second choice to walk toward a tired man and a little girl with a paper crown on a night when everything else had gone wrong, and say 4 words that changed all 3 of their lives. "You don't have to leave." Because the empty chair at that restaurant had not been waiting for the man who never came. It had been waiting for the family that was always meant to fill it.